There was a time in the early 1990s when one of the first things I did every morning when I woke up was to grab the Oregonian newspaper Metropolitan section and scan it to see if there had been any new murders in town since the day before. I wasn't interested in a particular crime. I wasn't afraid that they were looking for me, and I wasn't interested in a particular victim. I was an ambitious, young criminal defense attorney, and I wanted to make a name for myself. There is no better way to do that than to handle a murder case. I had learned that I was at the top of the list for appointments in Multnomah County, and since most people charged with murder can't afford their own attorneys, that meant that the next murderer arrested in Multnomah County was going to be my murderer. I didn't have to wait long for the call. I showed up at the arraignment and I was introduced to my client. I was handed a piece of paper, an indictment, and it charged my client with first-degree murder. It identified him by name, and it had an alias, Big Mike. Mike was really big. He was about 6'4", and he was swarthy, and he was sort of scary looking. And we did the arraignment. He entered a not guilty plea. The case was assigned to my favorite judge in the courthouse, Judge Irving Steinbach. And like me, Judge Steinbach was Jewish. I wasn't observant, and I never knew whether he was. But in the hallways of the courthouse, we had a friendly relationship based on our common heritage. I called him Irv, and he called me Wojciech. So after the case was assigned to him, I received the police reports. And I looked through them, and I saw that the charge was based on a suspected gang member being gunned down in the middle of a busy Northeast Portland street in broad daylight. There were eyewitnesses. All of them identified Mike. Some of them knew him and identified him by name. There was one gun found at the scene, and it was the gun that they all said Mike had thrown to the ground when he fled. That gun was analyzed, forensically analyzed, and fingerprints were found on it that matched Mike's fingerprints. And the bullet removed from the deceased victim was compared to the gun, and it was determined that that gun, with Mike's fingerprints, had fired the bullet that had killed the victim. This was not going to be an easy case. One of the first things you do, or I did when I was handling criminal cases, was retain a defense investigator, kind of like a police officer, a private investigator. And I did in this case, and sent her out to find some witnesses. The first person she brought back to me was Mike's girlfriend. And she told us that Mike was actually very gentle, kind, and socially adept, despite his imposing appearance. She also volunteered something that we were definitely not expecting. She said that when she and Mike had sex, Mike liked to dress up in baby clothes, wear diapers, and suck on a milk bottle. This was not the case I expected for my debut as a murder defense attorney. We hired a psychologist. She also said that Mike was intellectually disabled. So we hired a psychologist, not because of the sexual activity, but because of the issues related to his intelligence. The psychologist, who was a neuropsychologist, evaluated him and told us that Mike had an IQ in the low 70s, and that qualified him as being intellectually disabled. So my first murder case was not going to be a gangland slaying. It wasn't going to be a whodunit. It wasn't going to be a case of self-defense. It was going to be a charge against an imposingly large, threatening-looking, intellectually disabled man who role-played a baby in the bedroom. We got an offer from the prosecutor, and I urged Mike to take it. He gets to make the decision, though, as to whether he should go to trial or not, and he decided he really wanted a trial. So we moved forward with the trial, and the only viable defense at the trial was that Mike suffered from diminished capacity, that he was unable to form the intent to commit the crime that he was charged with. We also presented as a wild card backup his activities in the bedroom, just hoping that maybe that would humanize him and also make him look less imposing and threatening. Surprisingly, the jury was out for 4 days after they heard the evidence in the case. Unsurprisingly, when they came back, they convicted Mike. But our backup strategy worked. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in prison, the minimum sentence that you could give a person charged with murder. Mike went off to prison, and I didn't hear from him again for a long period of time. Then one day, I got a call from him. It was a collect call from the Oregon State Penitentiary. Although technically I was no longer his attorney, I accepted it. And he said, "Mr. Lawyer, I got a question for you. My judge, Steinbach, he was Jewish, wasn't he?" And I thought about it for a second, and then I thought, I don't think there's anything devious going on here, so I answered him, and I said yes. And he said, "I thought so." And then he said, "Mr. Attorney, I've got one more question for you. You're Jewish too, aren't you?" And this one took a little bit more thought. I began to wonder whether he was thinking that the judge and I had somehow colluded to his detriment at the trial. But I couldn't think of any reason not to answer him, so I did. And Mike almost yelled into the phone, "I knew it! I am so glad I was represented by one of you guys instead of one of them Caucasians." And I sat there with the phone up and a puzzled look on my face, and Mike hung up. It was as if he had won a bet and he couldn't wait to run off and tell the rest of the people in prison whatever the reason for asking that question was. I never heard from him again. I never heard what he was concerned about and why he had asked that question. But I always remembered Mike. I always remembered my first murder trial, and I always remembered that perplexing phone call. And I learned one lesson that I kept with me for the next 30 years of my practice of criminal defense work, and that was you should investigate absolutely everything and assume absolutely nothing. Thank you.